2023 saw many Yu-Gi-Oh! Debates take place on social media, YouTube, and other platforms. Arguments about price and accessibility of competitive cards and decks, how oppressive certain decks like Full Power Kashtira were, but easily my least favorite was the discussion that took place last format, primarily coming from pro players, about how having too many good decks in a format makes it unhealthy and means that it sucks. In my opinion, it's one of, if not the dumbest arguments in this entire game. However, as bad and nonsensical as that argument is, we couldn't even go a full week into the new January 1st New Year's Eve format before it reared its ugly head and people already started bringing it up again and saying that the new format is bad. To give further context, this is all stemming from a large European new format tournament that took place over the weekend. The event had 282 registered duelists and appeared to be fairly competitive, with Fire Kings being the most represented deck, followed by Labyrinth and mEtAgAmE. Pre-Phantom Nightmare, and even Maze of Millennia, this is probably what one would expect. However, when the dust all settled and the top 16 was established, it was revealed to be a completely different story and very reminiscent of YCS Indianapolis or Richmond from last format, aka an insanely diverse metagame where almost anything can top. In fact, the top 16 of this event featured a ridiculous 14 different decks. This included Unchained, for some reason Trickstar, Rika, Branded, Drytron, Purely, Branded Chimera, Bestial Runic, mEtAgAmE, Kashtira, Labyrinth, Fire Kings, and with Centurion and Tearlaments being the only decks that have multiple players representing them in the top cut. To me, I saw this as a wonderful sign, a great representation that, much like last format, this could be one, at least for now, where you could easily top a large-scale event like a YCS or even a medium-sized one like a regional with upwards of a dozen decks. Better yet, this doesn't even take into account some other solid competitive options like Flew Under Rees, Vanquished Soul, or Virtual/Dark World. However, there were some who, in typical elitist fashion, immediately dismissed it, saying things like, "Too many decks, truly a bad format at the moment, and enlightenment is realizing that diverse metas are insanely unhealthy and unfun." Interestingly enough, usually when you ask people why they believe these things, or to further explain, they fall back on arguments to the effect of there are too many decks to prepare and side deck for. One even said, "Yeah, I sure love having 100 decks in the format to prep for at a competitive event. I sure hope my 15 side cards are enough." This is a bad argument for a few reasons in my opinion. Number one, it implies that you're supposed to have side deck answers for every high level competitive deck that you might come across, like it's your birthright or something. Obviously, that's ludicrous. What's wrong with just beating someone without targeted side deck cards? Or, and this might be a wild and crazy theory this person never thought of, just running fairly generic cards that have overlap value. Are people aware that in other large and wildly successful TCGs like Pokemon, this is exactly what their players do? Because, surprise, there is no side deck in the Pokemon trading card game despite it being the best of 3. Pokemon players basically just tech their decks out with generically good cards that, while not necessarily broken, can cover a lot of ground in matchups. Kinda like what used to happen back in the GX era, where you'd see a whole bunch of players main decking cards like Mystical Space Typhoon, Dimensional Prison, and Book of Moon. Now let's modernize this and take for instance a card like Fantastical Dragon Phantasme, which can be highly effective against any deck in the game known to link summon, whether it's a link spam deck or not. For instance, polar opposites like Vanquished Soul and Rescue Ace. Or you can look at something like Cosmic Cyclone, which is a great one-for-one trade against almost any field spell that sees competitive play in the game right now, or continuous spells. Cosmic Cyclone can even work in some niche situations against cards that aren't even actual spells, like the Centurion monsters that act as trap cards. This idea that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is somehow better and more healthy when there's only 2 to 3 decks in the metagame, and you can dedicate a ton of hate cards for each specific matchup has always been nonsense, and as people pointed out on social media, it usually makes duels a lot worse. This might be more of a symptom of the times, but for the past 5 or so years, the side deck cards have become so ridiculously powerful that often, if successfully resolved and not immediately countered, they usually lead to auto wins and what most people like NBT refer to as non-games. A simple example of this would be using Dimensional Barrier against a deck like Purely, Branded, or Branded Chimera. Sure, your opponent can still attack or maybe maybe use a couple of effects here and there, but realistically, those decks are not going to be able to beat you if they can't fusion or Xyz summon. Usually what happens is they're just stopped in their tracks and you can just kill them on the crackback fairly easily, or on the off chance that you're playing a deck that maybe can't do enough damage to kill your opponent outright in a single turn, it doesn't matter because you'll just amass so much advantage that they simply won't be able to overcome it. It's not really a duel in the traditional sense, and it's completely decided off of one card, not skill. Before I go on, does that sound like a fun and more healthy competitive environment? One where, because there's only 2 to 3 decks in the metagame, everybody knows about and plays the blowout counters and silver bullet cards that auto win the game if you don't have the out? Because in my opinion, that doesn't sound very fun at all. Some might say, well, Cap, clearly it's these blowout cards that are a problem then, and with some of them like Eradicator Virus or Dimensional Barrier, I agree, and would be all for them getting banned because of how effective these cards can be across multiple matchups, combined with their competitive history of being successful blowout cards. But what about ones that no one thinks are problematic? What about Zombie World, which turns Fluunderies into barbecue chicken because they can't tribute summon anymore? Or Wretch Tri-Brigades because all their monsters in the graveyards are now zombies and the Tri-Monsters can't use their effects anymore? How about King Tiger Wangu, which can annihilate a deck like Sprite, or decks that are full of low attack monsters? Maybe Dinko Sekka against Dinomorphia or any other trap deck. These specific powerful cards aren't an issue at all, but if you were to enter a format with only 2 viable decks, and one of them was completely shut down by a card like these, it probably wouldn't be much fun if your opponent opened it against you and you just auto lost to it. This is the issue and one of my problems with the whole idea of only having 2 to 3 deck metas. You basically just end up with a bunch of your matches falling back into this. In fact, I think that you could even have a strong argument as to why wide open metas can be objectively more skillful than 2 to 3 deck ones, is that in wide metas you probably are less likely to side these gigantic blowout cards that are only effective against one or a few matchups, because it's probably more preferable to have less powerful cards that offer more coverage and overlap value for a wide range of matchups that you might encounter. Cards like Nibiru, Evenly Matched, Cosmic Cyclone, Ghost Bell, and Haunted Mansion, or maybe something like Fantastical Dragon Phantasmate. Cards that are far less likely to determine the outcome of games by themselves. I also think that having as few Yu-Gi-Oh decks in the metagame as possible is not only as boring as holy hell, but it genuinely goes against everything the spirit of Yu-Gi-Oh was built upon. This isn't chess where every match has the same exact pieces on both sides and they move the same ways every time. If you want to play only mirror matches and you never want to play anything outside of your little safe space, then that's fine, just go play chess or checkers. That way you'll always know exactly what you're playing against at a tournament even before you sit down and see your opponent. You'll never have to worry about a bad or new matchups or encountering anything new. But Yu-Gi-Oh on the other hand was built around variety. There's a reason that nearly every character in the anime had a different theme for their deck. Some characters like My Valentine even changed their theme mid-show just to keep things fresh. Why? Because it's more interesting and enjoyable that way. I think that's kind of obvious. How long do you think that the Yu-Gi-Oh TCG would have lasted if they only had Blue Eyes, Red Eyes, and Dark Magician as the sole archetypes in the game and every single card released just supported those 3 themes? It seems like people who complain about variety just want an easier tournament experience and simpler preparation for that event, but don't actually give objective, unbiased reasons for why wide open and diverse formats are bad or unhealthy for the game. It's usually just blah blah blah, it's too hard for me to side deck, which is fine, but it just reeks of bias. Being able to adapt, in my opinion, for the unknown is a skill in itself, and during these wide open metagames, we usually get the most amount of innovation. Like seriously, who would have thought that Bestial Runic would have been a pick to take to a YCS when Rescue Ace, Labyrinth, and Tearlament were expected to be the best decks? And yet one of the best players in the entire Yu-Gi-Oh TCG took a seemingly random deck that he cooked up in his garage and went and won a YCS championship with that. In my opinion, it's not that complicated. Prepare for what you expect to see the most, take side precautions for bad matchups and scenarios that you might encounter, and worry about what you can control. Is there going to be some luck involved when there's a wide open format? Yeah, but guess what? There's always luck involved in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a game with luck inherently baked into the the design, so that's not something that's new to the game. Anyways, those are just my thoughts and opinions, and I'd like to know yours. Leave that in the comment section below. I may be completely off my rocker on this, but I do not believe that I am, and I feel like this whole debate about too many decks makes the game bad or makes the meta unhealthy, it's just silly. It's nonsense at this point. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, as always.